Welcome to This Week in Hearing. I'm Shari Eberts, and today's guest is Shanna Groves, creator of lipreadingmom.com and author of the new book, How I Hear: Confessions of a Lip Reading Mom. Shanna brings a powerful perspective on what it really means to navigate the world with hearing loss, especially as someone who relies on lip reading. In her book, she shares honest, eye-opening stories about communication, parenting, and self-advocacy. So welcome to the podcast today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you for having me today, Sherry. I'm very excited to converse with you.
Absolutely. So I always love to start off with a story because every person with a hearing loss
Mhm.
has a story. And I was hoping that you could share a bit of yours for the viewers today.
Sure. Well, most of us in the deaf or hearing loss community don't have a book that tells our story,
I love that. That's
but I
great.
am holding up this as a visual aid, which we'll talk about more. This is my book. This is my personal story of my hearing loss, how I hear. The first 6 years of my hearing loss journey. And I identify as hard of hearing, but more recently, in the last 12 months, I developed more deafness. And so I had cochlear implant surgery done in 2025. And now I identify as being medically deaf with a cochlear implant. I also wear hearing aid in the non-implant ear. So I think the technology is what keeps me hard of hearing. Without the technology, I would have profound hearing loss. And so my hearing loss was not detected until I was 27 years old. But going back many years before that, when I was a child, I did have difficulty with some listening activities at school. And my parents had my hearing tested when I was very young. And it was determined that my hearing was fine, but that I just needed to pay attention.
Mm.
So for many, many years, I went with what we believe now was an undiagnosed hearing loss or it was misdiagnosed. And so at age 27, it was 2 months after the birth of my oldest child. I was struggling with my hearing very much so. There were many sounds I could no longer hear in the high frequency range. I also developed tinnitus, and it was very scary being a new mom, also planning to return back to work. And a lot of my work involved telephone. So I had my hearing loss diagnosed when my oldest son was about 3 months old. And
Wow.
that's been my journey now for 25 years.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, mine was diagnosed in my mid-20s as well, but I never
Mhm.
perceived an issue with my hearing or attention or, whatever they
Mhm.
were trying to blame it on for you. So it was really sort of a surprise for me in my 20s. When you experienced that diagnosis, was it sort of a relief for you, or how did you react to that, given, I guess, some of the struggles that you had faced prior to that?
Yes. I think that it answered a lot of questions as to why listening activities were so difficult for me growing up and also being in noisy situations. I was exhausted
Yeah.
after trying to listen to people, thinking that it was my attention that was preventing me from being able to engage in conversations fully. But all the pieces started to come together when I received the well, it's considered progressive. So that's why now I've considered deaf. It's a progressive sensory neural bilateral hearing loss. And with that, I guess it did answer some questions for me, but it also created new questions, such as,
Right.
what am I going to do now? And so the world of hearing technology was presented to me, and I had all these options on how to hear better, hearing aids, and uh, you know, auditory training, different things like that. But my brain was just spinning, trying to accept that diagnosis, and it took me a while, I think, to become comfortable with it enough to say, yes, I do need to wear hearing aids every day.
Yeah. I can absolutely relate to that. And I'm sure
Yes.
many people listening to this podcast can relate to that as well, or to their patients experiencing that, right? Sort of that denial and that just those emotional reactions to hearing loss are very common and need to be acknowledged as part of the treatment plan for sure.
Absolutely. I think that with a hearing loss, there, especially if it is diagnosed in our adult years or later in life, that we have to come to terms with processing the emotions behind that. And so I went through, I keep thinking about the first 6 years from my hearing loss diagnosis to, 6 years later, that was like the process of trying to accept it. And I went through the stages of denial and
Hmm.
bargaining and sadness and anger. And then finally, I started to accept it. And when I started accepting it, then I became more comfortable with finding a community of other people who are deaf and hard of hearing, and being able to embrace my own identity helped me to seek out that community.
Yeah, absolutely. So we first met many years ago, really, when through your blog, I guess, lipreadingmom.com. So tell us a little bit about how you started that, why you started it, and what some of the biggest challenges for you have been as a mom with hearing loss.
15 years ago, Um, and it was in wintertime. I was at home with my youngest son. He was about 3. He hadn't started school yet, and my other two children were in school all day. But we were sitting there. He was playing with his Thomas the Train track, and I'm just observing his curiosity and his fascination with these wooden train pieces, putting everything together. And he was like in his creative world. It made me think, well, I have this time, and I'm dealing with my hearing loss and I'm finally starting to accept it. What can I do with this extra time on my hands when my other children were in school? And so while my youngest son played with his trains or whatever toy he had in front of him, I started my blog, which is Lip Reading Mom. And I came up with the name of Lip Reading Mom because I'm a very visual listener, and so I have to see someone's face and have my full attention focused on that face to be able to understand what they are saying to me. And that's not always a sure thing. If I can see you, I can hear you, because there's other factors involved, such as noise and the volume and tone of the person's voice. But for the most part, I'm more likely to understand other people's speech, including my children's, if I can see their face while they're talking. And so lip reading came about because I found that, instead of making eye contact, I was making contact with the speaker's lips
Lip
when I'm
contact, if that's a
talking.
word,
Yes,
right?
I'm looking down instead of up at their eyes. And that opened a whole new world, actually, a few years later when I was asked by some local businesses that cater to our senior adult population. I live in Kansas. And so they were asking if I could teach their residents with hearing loss how to lip read. And I hadn't even thought about it. I think they had found my blog and figured, oh, she might be a person who could teach us to lip read. And I started doing a lot of research into understanding speech communication. And I actually worked in public schools. I have a special education master's and working with people with deafness and hearing loss. And so I just started putting all this education together and put together my own curriculum for lip reading classes in the Kansas City metro area that I have been teaching since 2013. So the lip reading mom evolved into a new opportunity to teach other people
Wow.
about lip reading and good communication with the deaf hard of hearing.
I love that. And so some people refer to it as speech reading
It
rather
is.
than lip reading. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the differences there, if you do, and why you talk about lip reading versus speech reading?
Yes. Well, I honestly believe that they can be used interchangeably. A lot of people, especially those who do not identify as deaf hard of hearing, automatically think of the word lip reading. They not familiar with the terms of speech reading. But speech reading, yes, it does incorporate more than just speech recognizable on the speaker's lips. That there are other things involved in spoken communications, such as facial expressions and body language, and also context of the conversation. So, all those different elements actually are a part of speech and communication. And the lip reading is one part of the speech reading communication, if you will. However, most people call it lip reading. I'm fine using those terms interchangeably.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think that most just lay people kind of think of lip reading and they probably mean speech reading, but they're just using the terms almost interchangeably, like you mentioned.
Yes. I don't correct people either
Yeah.
because more likely if I say speech reading to someone who's not familiar, they would think that I write speeches for people or that I read speeches. It would not be familiar to them at all. And then I would have to go into a long process of explaining. But
Yeah.
just in a casual conversation with someone who I'm not trying to sell my teaching to, I would probably just use the words lip reading because that's what a lot of people are most familiar with hearing.
Yeah, absolutely. So you were telling us a little bit about how you were working and a lot of your work was on the telephone, many years ago. How has your hearing loss impacted your career over time, and how have you sort of adapted that and incorporated that into your work over time?
Yes, it's a good question. My professional background before I returned to college and got my special education degree is I was a journalist. I worked in the communications field, and a lot of my communications with my interview subjects were on the phone. I did have some face-to-face conversations, and this predated Zoom or Skype and that technology. So if you weren't sitting in the room with someone that you were interviewing, you were doing your communication by phone, possibly by email, but mostly by phone. And I do remember there were some conversations that I had to keep asking for repeats. And then even after I thought I understood what they were saying, I would repeat it back to them to make sure that I had understood correctly. So there were things I was doing even before my diagnosis of progressive hearing loss that were clues that I wasn't hearing well. I put it all together now. And so my career now with thank goodness we have virtual conferencing, we have Zoom, we have Teams video conferencing, we have all these great visual ways to communicate with one another. And I tend to gravitate more towards video versus just audio-based communication. And we might be talking a little bit more about this, but I did start a podcast after my cochlear implant surgery, about 3 months after. It's called the Definitely Talking Podcast, DEAF, Definitely Talking. And the reason why is I've been fascinated with the idea of a podcast for many years because they are so popular, and that's how a lot of people receive content is through auditory. However, I'd also seen that there were some podcasters who were putting their streaming on YouTube, and now Spotify even allows video as well as audio only content. And so I thought, with me being able to hear better with my cochlear implant, I developed more confidence in being able to have a virtual conversation with someone that is actually videotaped and later posted on the internet as a podcast. So the cochlear implant and my previous background in journalism came full circle when I launched the Definitely Talking podcast.
Well, and I think I was one of your first guests on that podcast as well, which was a lot of fun. So, talk a little bit about the theme there because you're inviting different
Mhm.
individuals with hearing loss. And why did you decide to focus on that as the topic of the podcast?
Mhm. Well, for many years, I identified as hard of hearing, and in more recent years, I'm become medically deaf with a cochlear implant and a hearing aid. And so I believe, and I know a lot of people also do, in the hearing healthcare field or allies such as myself, that deafness and hearing loss are both a spectrum. So someone who may identify as deaf might still have some residual hearing, but they identify as deaf because they need more visual communication to be able to understand. And that could be in the form of sign language, or some people use cued speech, or some people need visual aids, hand gestures, writing notes down. Those are all visual ways to communicate. And the hard of hearing, a lot of people think of hard of hearing as we just need to speak louder,
Right.
have more volume when we talk to that person. But for some people who are hard of hearing, the louder the person's voice, the more distorted the speech sounds to them. And for some who have hypersensitivity to certain sound frequencies, it could be very painful to them. And so I wanted to recognize with the Definitely Talking podcast that even though I use the word deaf in the title, that I'm actually spotlighting people in that entire community, in that spectrum of deaf and hard of hearing, because I believe together we're stronger. Divided between deaf and hard of hearing, we are not stronger. And we are a community and better together, I think. So I wanted to have a podcast that would spotlight this community. And most of the guests have been people who identify as deaf or hard of hearing. And so their stories are the content of the podcast. And they're amazing stories. These are people who are inventors, authors, teachers. They're doing all kinds of great work. And our commonality is we can't hear well. So that is just one facet of who we are in that community. The podcast shows more of what that community is all about and what we are all capable of when we set our minds to our dreams and our goals and what we want to accomplish.
I love that so much because I know when you develop hearing loss, sometimes it can really be a hit to your confidence, right? Because you think that, well, I may not be able to achieve what I want to at work or personally. And seeing others really incorporate their hearing loss successfully into their lives and living well with it, I remember gave me a lot of hope that I would be able to do the same thing. So I love that you're highlighting people who, and it's not perfect, right? People still struggle, but people who have incorporated that struggle into their daily lives and continue to achieve the goals that they have for themselves despite the challenges from hearing loss. So I love that you're really highlighting some of these role models and just regular people who are doing their lives and also have hearing loss because it can be very supportive and inspirational to people who are starting to begin their journey and see that there is hope and there are role models for success. So I love that so much.
Well, I consider you, Sherry, a role model
Oh, sweet.
for the hearing loss community. And that's why you were one of my first guests on Definitely Talking, because I wanted to start off that series with some very strong, encouraging examples of what we can do despite or with our hearing loss, and your platform and your focus on helping the hearing loss community and building those bridges of communication between people who can hear and who don't, as well as building the bridge between those in the hearing loss community and professionals who serve the hearing loss community, I think is very powerful. And so I want to compliment you on how you've opened a lot of doors for a lot of us to share our stories.
Well, thank you for including me in that group because you have such a great lineup. So I really appreciate that. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about your books. So, your first book, Lip Reader, is a novel about a family living with deafness inspired by a true story. So, what made you want to write your new book, How I Hear Confessions of a Lip Reading Mom? And how are the books different? Did you have different goals for them? So, how did that evolve?
Yes. Well, Lip Reader was published in 2009, and currently it is only available as an ebook that you can purchase on Amazon Kindle. So I highly encourage those of you who do like to read, you know, ebooks, that it is still available. It's just the print version is no longer available. I wrote that book when I was finally coming to my hearing loss acceptance, but I wanted to know more about the history of my family's hearing loss. So, Sherry, I know you've mentioned in previous interviews that you also have a family history of hearing loss on your dad's side.
Yeah.
Well, my dad's family has genetic deafness and hearing loss. My
Mhm.
dad, who is no longer with us, he's passed away, but he had typical hearing. However, his brother and his sister were both identified as deaf, hard of hearing, and his dad was hard of hearing, and he had generations going back of deafness and hearing loss. I wanted to write a book about a family written from the perspective of a 12-year-old girl. So, and this is written in 1980s. So about the time when I was 12, if I'm
Wow.
putting myself kind of as the narrator, even though this is fiction, I'm thinking like a 12-year-old in this book. And she's going to meet her deaf, hard of hearing family in a different state for the first time. Her mom, who essentially we find out later grew up as a coda, a child of deaf adults. She never told her daughter that she grew up as a coda because her mom, she was ashamed to share that facet of her family. She thought there was a stigma. And this was the 1980s. So you know, there's been stigma and these decades of people not understanding that deafness and hearing loss, they might have equated it to intelligence issue, which is far from it. And so my family, who I actually knew in real life, they encountered a lot of that stigma. And I wanted to go back in time and tell a fictionalized story, but something that I actually kind of lived with my deaf, hard of hearing family members. And I wanted to share their culture. I wanted to share how they communicate. I wanted to just share these are real people with real lives. And, like we've talked about before, deafness and hearing loss is just one aspect of who we are. I wanted to explore more of their personalities, the family dynamics, and why did mom keep the deafness and hearing loss covered up
Interesting.
for all
Mhm.
those years? So
Interesting.
it's a very good story about that. And then after writing a fictionalized story based on real life, I decided to write a real story based on real life, and
Mhm.
that is this book,
I love
How
it.
I Hear. Confessions of a Lip-Reading Mom. The Confessions of a Lip-Reading Mom. I Back in 2013, I actually did publish a version of this book, and it actually went out of print about 6 years ago. So I wanted to publish an updated version of that book that had some new details. Also, I wanted to have it available in different formats. So it's available in hardcover, paperback, ebook. And I wanted to get the book back out there. A couple of reasons for that. Number one is I think by sharing our stories of our disability, our hearing loss, or deafness, that we are educating others. We're empowering our community with our stories and that truth seeking that is out there when we share our stories is so engaging, I think, to readers and an audience that they see someone who is truly and still living with this in their life. And also, I wanted to share about being a mom. So, The Confessions of a Lip Reading Mom, the subtitle for the book is based on, there were a lot of things as a lip reading mom through the years that were unique and different experiences that I wanted to kind of characterize them as confessions. And so each chapter title has a different confession that I wanted to make as a lip reading mom. And a lot of the confessions are really funny. They have a lot of humor, but also there's a lot of heart there. And I think that this book will speak well, not only to those who are deaf, hard of hearing, but I think people who want to understand deafness and hearing loss, a real story, and see the heart behind the diagnosis, that there is a person there who's dealing with grief, who's of hearing loss, who's dealing with their emotions, who is in a career and how hearing loss impacts their career, who is raising a family. How does the hearing loss impact their parenting, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, it becomes a story from first being diagnosed to eventual acceptance and all the messy details in between.
I love that.
And fun details too.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a very emotional read. It's really a wonderful book. And I know you do go out of your way to share some practical tips as well for people with hearing loss in that book as part of the story. So are there one or two that you would want to share with our audience as we start to wrap up here?
Yes. Practical tips. Again, we've mentioned this before, but hearing loss is a spectrum. And if we had typical hearing in our younger years, and then we develop hearing loss later in life, or we become deaf. Mine is a progressive hearing loss, so I went through being hard of hearing to becoming deaf, that there is a period of grief that we have to go through, just like grieving the passing of a loved one. Our hearing, our ability to hear, if we had it and then we start to lose it or we lose it all, it is a process of acceptance. And I think I want to have the reader understand that it is very important to walk through that process. Don't rush it. There's no right or wrong answer to how you come to accept your hearing loss or deafness. And I want people to know it's okay not to be okay. That is sometimes, a cliche, and we've heard it before, but sometimes with our hearing loss, it's not all rainbows and unicorns. And I wanted to put that out there too, some of the struggle. But ultimately, the acceptance part, I think, is the beautiful thing. And so I want the reader to know that the process of accepting hearing loss is takes time, and to please, if you don't have hearing loss but you want to support someone who does, to respect their feelings about what they're going through, to respect how they communicate, to respect what their needs are, and to just keep communicating with them, keep trying to engage them in the community and be a friend to them, because in that time of uncertainty with hearing loss, we do need our friends. We need our loved ones to surround us with support.
Well said. And thank you so much for being here, talking with me today and about the inspiring new book that you have out. And for people who want to follow your writing and your advocacy work, they can also check out lipreadingmom.com. So thanks so much, Shanna. It was great talking with you.
Thank you, Sherry, and thank you all for watching and listening.